Good morning, everyone. Welcome along, both to those of you in the room and those who are joining us online. My name is Lachlan Blackhall. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at the ANU, and it's a great pleasure to have you here for the update that we're here for today. So before I begin, please allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respect to elders past and present. One of the things that's really important to me when we make an acknowledgement of country is to think about what we're committing to as a consequence of that acknowledgement. And for me, overseeing the research and innovation portfolio, my commitment is to elevate the standing of First Nations research and First Nations researchers. And I think that's critically important for the work that we're here to talk about today. Indigenous First Nations people of Australia and around the world have been caring for our environment for millennia. And it's critically important at this point in time that we ensure that we're leveraging all of the knowledge systems that the world has on offer to tackle the great challenges of our age. So for me, when making an acknowledgement of country, that's what I'm committing to. So as I said, I oversee the research and innovation portfolio. The Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions sits within that portfolio, and it's a great pleasure to host them within our portfolio. ICEDS was the merging together of several former institutes related to climate, energy and disaster solutions. So we weren't too creative when we came to putting the acronym together. But what's really important to me is that there was decades of work in those institutes that has come together in ICEDS, and I thank them for hosting the update today. So the theme for today is obviously taken from Dorothea Mackellar's My Country poem, which is an iconic poem. And for those of you who don't know it, I just thought I'd read to you the first few lines of the second stanza of it. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. And it is an iconic poem because it represents the extremes of climate and of nature that we've had here in Australia for a very long time. But obviously things are changing. With climate change representing an existential challenge, not only for humanity, but for the world as a whole, we're dealing with natural disasters now at a frequency and a scale that was really hitherto unimaginable. And that feels like it's accelerating away. So as we gather today, we're gathering at a time when the realities of climate and disaster resilience are pressing on communities here in Australia and across the world. Floods, droughts, fires, and other extreme events continue to test our systems, our infrastructure, I think most importantly, our people and our communities. So our task today is not just to share knowledge, but it's to strengthen the connection between science, policy, economics, and lived experience. Events like this are an opportunity to ensure that the research and innovation that we do here at the university and across the territory and around Australia actually translate into solutions that meaningfully address the challenges that we're facing. So at ANU, and through the work of our colleagues and our collaborators in government, in industry, in the community, we're advancing evidence-based, innovative and inclusive approaches to disaster resilience. I think it's really important to note that these are not challenges that can be solved by any one discipline or any one organisation. It's really critical that we come together, we recognise that these are the ultimate transdisciplinary problems, and that by working together, we're actually able to progress solutions that are meaningful for people, for the community, and for the world. So as I said, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the event today. I'd like to acknowledge Llewellyn, Aidan, and the entire ICEDS team and all of our speakers and panelists who'll be presenting this morning. It's a pleasure to have you on campus here at ANU, whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us virtually. And I hope you have a really productive and fruitful meeting this morning, and recognise that it's really going to be through our collective efforts that we can better understand and respond to the devastating impact of natural disasters here in Australia and around the world. So welcome all, and delighted to formally open the meeting. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Alexandra. I'm a researcher at ICIDS and at the Institute of Water Futures. Yes, tribute to Dorothy McCullough, and many of you may not know the third stanza, but it says something like, England's ordered fields and hedges still run deep in my veins. But perhaps after this more than 100 years, perhaps we've shed some of that and are starting to live like Australians in the Australian continent. Thank you, Lachlan, and thanks to all who are in attendance. It's my pleasure also to welcome you to this disaster solution update. I'd like to echo Lachlan's and endorse his welcome to country, his acknowledgement of country, and extend it to the entire country. For about a decade now, it's been my pleasure working with Indigenous native title holders in the Kimberleys, and through an organisation called the Muttawarra Fitzroy River Council that are pictured here, and they represent 6 native title groups in the Fitzroy or Muttawarra River catchment, and they are working to protect that river from the excesses of irrigation extraction, extractive mining proposals and other threats. Now, working with them has taught me quite a lot about rivers and about a way of operating in the world where rivers are central to our humanity and our spirituality and our existence. Now, in addition to their concerns about extractive developments, they're also concerned about the impacts of climate change. And in fact, have been running a project for the last 3 years trying to understand climate change impacts in the Kimberleys. And to give you, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and to give you an example, that's the new Fitzroy River Bridge. The old one was blown out by the 23 flood. And that flood, cyclone or a post-cyclone rain depression, was the most extreme in recorded history. Now, we only have an instrumental record in most of Australia, a little over 100 years old, some places 140 or 150, and perhaps we're naive to think that that's a meaningful record of the climatic extremes in this continent. But also, we're almost getting tired of hearing about unprecedented events, record-breaking events. Now, despite the capacity for destruction, I just want to start by saying floods are incredibly important in this continent in a beneficial way. They are resetting events that regenerate floodplains, and they really are the boom in the boom-bust cycle of our ecosystems. So it's important we don't just think of floods as destructive. They're actually part of the creative and regenerative cycle in Australia. And it's the same all over the continent. We have these vast floodplains where life is triggered by flooding. Now, in today's update, we have 6 speakers. We have 3 who are going to handle the flood side, and after morning tea, 3 that are going to deal with drought. And the main focus is on this idea of policies for prevention. How can we avoid droughts and floods becoming disasters? Now, many of you have been to former climate or disaster updates, will have heard Mark Howden talking. And Mark eloquently describes the latest science and what's happening with climate change and why we are dealing with more and more extreme events. Now, I'm not going to restate or attempt to restate the facts about that, other than to emphasise that the world we're living in is the climate that was predicted by scientists 30 years ago. So our current extremes of a hotter, drier and more extreme climate are in fact what we were warned about 30 years ago. And focus on prevention, policies for prevention, is to start to address, to take the scientific warning seriously and ask what can be done. This bomb that's 2-year climate anomalies, as at 1st of July, you can see Southern Australia, deficiencies in rain, particularly those areas that are dependent on the rain-bearing weather systems that come through the roaring 40s. And then in the northern half of the continent, greater rainfall. And this is a pattern we should get used to. And I'll go into that in a little more. But when I looked into it, 24 out of the last 30 years, we've had below average cool season rains in southern Australia. So reference to the average, we might in fact be better off talking about the new normal of the drying of the southern half of the continent. Yeah, so the warnings, here's a graphic description of it, what we better get used to. Oh. Gary, I need some help. Okay, so this new climate reality presents significant challenges for disaster risk reduction, but also for governance and policy making more generally. I wish to briefly recap not just 2025, but the extremes that we've been through for the last 25 years. The map there represents the conditions of the tinderbox drought that led to the Black Summer fires. And this one here is, as of 2007, the deficiencies in rainfall, that was the Millennium Drought. Now, with the Millennium Drought, 2011 or late 2010, beginning of 2011, the drought broke with extreme flooding events in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales and elsewhere. And the tinderbox drought also broke with flooding rains in 21 and 22. Let's turn to 2025. Flooding rains in southwest or western Queensland and the Channel Country. Again, I searched through some of the headlines what I was going to put up, but unprecedented floods, most extreme on record, towns that had never been flooded seriously, underwater, etc., vast areas. And then that was in March and April, but also Cyclone Alfred. If we look briefly at Cyclone Alfred, if you remembered, it wandered around off the coast for a bit over a week, sort of clearly an unpredictable, doesn't follow the forecast, doesn't do what it's told. It's a cyclone. But the important thing about it is that in the past, most cyclones that had come that far south would have dissipated because the ocean temperatures weren't warm enough to sustain them. So we take that event and ask, what do we learn from it? Well, fortunately, the severe wind speeds were declined before it made landfall, and the building damage wasn't extreme. But if it had made landfall over Greater Brisbane with extreme winds, the damage would have been severe because our building standards don't extend the cyclone belt that far south. So what do we do with a changed reality that we should anticipate more cyclones, let's say from Coffs Harbour north, or draw the line where you like? The question I'm posing is, what do we do? Do we change all new building standards? Do we retrofit lots of old buildings, or do we just treat it like a lottery and hope that a major cyclone doesn't make landfall over an urban area? So the other point I want to make about all these events is that the profound human effects. I was at a conference in early June, and this slide from the Red Cross, from the director of the Red Cross, he'd asked his staff to produce a map of where the Red Cross had provided emergency assistance in 25. They presented that map to him and he said, "Is that right? That looks like far too many events." And there was, you know, as I've said, there was major flooding, but there was also fires, storms, etc. Now, each one of these events has profound human impacts, and many communities take years to respond, to recover, if they do recover. So it's important. We see them on the news, then they lose currency, but think about them not as an event, but a sustained process of change. I just wanted to talk about an additional disaster in 2025, and that's the marine algal bloom in South Australia. The Goyder Institute, a research institute in South Australia, says that the likely causes are a combination of the major discharge from the Murray floods in 2022, which was the second biggest flood that we have recorded for the Murray. 56 was bigger. That discharged huge quantities of nutrient-rich water into the ocean. But that combined with higher sea surface temperatures, warmer oceans, but also extraordinarily still conditions through the last autumn. So it's one of these compounding or multiple causal processes, but also, for those of you who know a lot about algae, it's probably, or marine ecosystems or even freshwater ecosystems, there's probably some degree of randomness as to which species of algae gets to dominate those conditions. I spoke to a fellow in South Australia who's very senior in their disaster management, and he said the disturbing thing there was that, he said, if it's a fire or a flood, we can charge out there and do something. We're equipped for it, we're experienced with it. In this case, he said, all the emergency agencies sitting around, we can't do anything. So they're people who feel like it's their job to respond to disasters, but in a way there was nothing that could be done. According to the Marine Conservation Society, the algal bloom is due to ecosystem distress fueled by a combination of human-driven pressures, a prolonged marine heat wave caused by climate change, altered ocean conditions, such as relatively calm marine conditions, and the nutrient-rich runoff from the river catchments. Now, you're going to hear a little more from our panel about the work we're doing on flood mitigation, but one of our case studies is the Richmond catchment, with Lismore as one of the cities there, and several of us were in Lismore in May at the time when a major storm was coming down the New South Wales coast. We were just north of it there. Few people rang up to check that we were all right. We were about 100 kilometres away from where the rain event was really serious. And that's the rain that led to the catastrophic flooding on the mid-north coast in places like the Manning Valley. Our experience of that consultation is that the communities or members of the community around Lismore, in and around Lismore, the flood crisis that they've experienced in 2017, 2022 is ongoing. So they had been through nearly 2 weeks of flood warnings through Cyclone Alfred, and they were getting them again due to this storm that was coming down the coast. And it's not just a physical crisis. The sense we got is it's a crisis of governance. People have either lost or are losing faith in the capacity of governments to meaningfully prepare for or prevent floods in this area. Now, for me, one of the most interesting findings was that there's a fellow, Floriano Volpato, who was the proprietor of a WOG cafe in Lismore. I can say that proudly, coming from a WOG family that ran cafes in country towns. But he was a very successful businessman. He started the Continental Club. He loved living in the Northern Rivers, and he just couldn't understand why people put up with repeated flooding. And he used his own money to bring I think I need help again, Jerry. I got it. Yeah, 1981, after the 70s floods, he used his own money to pay for 2 Italian flood engineers to come to Lismore and develop a flood diversion plan. And they proposed a bypass channel that went west of the city, and they presented it to the council, and the council rejected it. But the engineers believed that this channel would at least minimise flood damage in the town. Now I need help. Thank you. Yeah, that's the slide we go. Now I want to move to what I call the tale of 2 cities. 100 kilometres south of Lismore is Grafton. Grafton's it's roughly the same size city. It's on a slightly bigger river, the Clarence, biggest river in New South Wales. And the city of Grafton has been investing in a levee bank around the town, continues to build parts of it, but for nearly 100 years. And that levee has withstood or protected that town from floods throughout that time. The big ones that we've experienced in this decade, well, the last 2 decades, the floods came very close to the top of the levee. So it might be time to make an addition to the levee. Now, there's many who claim that levees don't work or increase the risks of catastrophic flooding, but I'd certainly rather live in a town that only gets flooded once every 100 years rather than once every 20 years. And part of the reason I'm mentioning this is the work you're going to hear about nature-based solutions. One of the most interesting findings, for me at least, is that there are often opportunities to combine nature-based and traditional hard engineering. And the point is that we don't want to set up a false binary to say nature-based is the only way to go or hard engineering is the right way to go. It's actually a complex set of problems that always require a contextual approach where we work out what are the best options given a particular circumstance. Excuse me. Now, generally, I've been focusing on specific examples, but we know that Australia is about to, or the Australian government is about to release the National Climate Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Plan. And we shouldn't be thinking about disaster mitigation or disaster relief and climate adaptation as separate endeavours. They're in fact both ways of dealing with how we plan for or prepare for the future. So I just want to go briefly into an example of a national climate risk assessment. Back in about 2009, I came across the Dutch Room for the River program. It's an important example of a 21st century climate risk and flood mitigation approach that uses both hard and soft engineering. Now, the Dutch are masters of flood engineering, water engineering. More than half their country would be under sea level, or is under sea level, and would be unusable without their commitment to this kind of engineering. I came across the early stages, what's called Room for the River 1. I think it was started in 2007. And in 2009, I was looking for examples around the world where countries were taking climate change seriously enough to modify their approach to rivers. Now, I remind you, I was doing that from Australia in the midst of a drought, and I was thinking I would be finding climate risk from a drought point of view, but the Dutch had identified their biggest risk being increased flooding in the Rhine. So they have invested billions, and Room for the River 1 has now finished, and they're now into Room for the River 2. So many billions in expanding out or increasing the area that the river can flood so that it doesn't flood, doesn't take out towns and cities. They're moving levee banks back from the river, etc. And it's hard to imagine the scale of it, but it's also hard to imagine the detail that they go through in terms of landscape architecture, planning, consultation, etc. I've mentioned it's a hybrid solution that combines hard and soft engineering or nature-based solutions. And the next stage, they're also planning to respond to the risk of drying as well. So I mentioned this as an example of a national climate risk assessment and response to it that's been active for almost 2 decades. My view in Australia, we have been engaged in unfruitful climate wars over that period, and as a result, we have a climate adaptation deficit that we really need to accelerate or mobilise in order to deal with it. So I thought I'd finish. Many years ago, I used to give a talk and I say 3 rules for living well in Australia, or 3 principles, let's not call them rules. The first is that floodplains are for floods. The second is that bushfires burn the bush. And the third is that droughts are not exceptional circumstances, but an expected and recurrent pattern in Australia's climate. So how do we apply those principles to the way we plan and prepare? And so I guess the important thing is it's not really a question of if, but when. So we know these things are coming. Do we face up to it? Do we live like we are living in Australia and anticipate those conditions? Taking a pragmatic approach, there are towns, many of them, cities built on floodplains, and we either invest in prevention, perhaps go for relocation, or deal with recovery after flood events. So at ICIDS, we've been researching nature-based solutions to flooding for the last 3 years, guided by Rosalind Prinsley, who'll be speaking next. I mentioned the national planning, national risk assessment. We have our own experience of flooding right here or here. And as I said, it's part of our reality that we're facing up to. So for every complex problems, there are simple solutions and they're always wrong. And so the main point I want to emphasize there is the work we're doing on nature-based solutions shows that if we are to develop solutions that are technically feasible, socially acceptable, and economically responsible, we have to deal with the complexity of each and every situation, not apply formulaic approaches. So I've got them here. Thank you very much. They're so well organised. I should thank the ICID staff who organised this event. Okay, the 3 speakers coming next who are going to deal with this complexity, each from a different perspective. I think I'm meant to introduce all 3 of you. So first is Rosalind Prinsley, who's an associate professor leading disaster solutions, now at the School of Engineering. She's one of Australia's leading academics in the field of disaster transformational or transdisciplinary research in disasters, and she's led major research initiatives, one of which you're going to hear about. Second will be Kirsty Wishing, who's an anthropologist who's working jointly on a joint venture between ANU and CSIRO, and her work is focused on Indigenous Australians' cultural values and perspectives on flood mitigation or flood management in the Richmond River catchment. And then we're going to hear from Tony Webster, who's a visiting fellow at ANU, an economist who specialises in public policy, economics, impact analysis, capability building in public sector agencies and reform. He has been the lead economics researcher for our nature-based solutions work. So over to Rosalind. Thank you.